Samantha had always loved hiking. It was her escape from the noise of the world, the constant buzz of technology, and the never-ending pressures of daily life. After a particularly challenging few months, an exhausting job, a troubled relationship, and too many sleepless nights, she decided it was time for a break. A few days in the pines, away from the distractions of civilization, would do wonders for her mental state. She planned everything meticulously, picking a remote area deep in the forest, far from any tourist trails. This was going to be her refuge, the perfect place to clear her mind and reconnect with herself. The drive to the trailhead was long but peaceful. The towering trees seemed to stretch endlessly as she ventured further into the woods, the world around her becoming more isolated and quiet with each passing mile. By the time she arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting golden light over the forest floor. She gathered her gear from the trunk, strapped on her backpack, and set off toward the trail. The further she walked, the more the forest seemed to envelop her. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the soft crunch of her boots on the forest floor. Samantha felt a sense of calm wash over her. There were no deadlines, no demands, just the peaceful hum of nature. She smiled, breathing in the fresh, clean air. This was exactly what she needed. However, as she trekked deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle at first, a sense that the woods were too quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. But she dismissed it as the usual nerves before a solo adventure. Maybe she was just overthinking it. After all, she'd hiked many times before. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She quickened her pace, trying to brush off the feeling. The campsite she'd chosen was nestled beside a small creek, surrounded by tall, dense trees. It was perfect. The water provided a calming background noise, and the clearing felt open and airy, a place where she could relax. She set up her tent and unpacked her things, her earlier unease slowly fading. After all, she was just being paranoid. She made a small fire, sat back and watched the flames flicker in the growing darkness, feeling the weight of her stress begin to lift. Little did she know, the forest had already begun to close in around her. As the night deepened, Samantha huddled by the fire, warming her hands as she sipped on a hot cup of tea. The forest around her was quiet, save for the occasional crackle from the fire and the gentle gurgle of the creek. It felt peaceful. She could hear nothing out of the ordinary, no wind, no animals scurrying about, just the steady pulse of nature. But there was something in the stillness, a strange sense of emptiness that made her feel like she was being watched. She shook off the thought and focused on the flames instead. She was being silly, she knew. The night sky was a blanket of stars, with no light pollution to spoil the view. Samantha felt a deep sense of awe, staring up at the constellations, feeling small but connected to something much larger. She could hear the distant sound of wind rustling the trees, but the air around her remained unerringly still. Even the creek seemed to slow its flow as though the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time the fire had dwindled to embers, Samantha was ready to turn in. She crawled into her tent, zipped herself in, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. There was something off about the forest, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her eyes darted around the dark corners of the tent as her mind raced. Was it just the isolation? She couldn't say. But she knew one thing, she wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched intensified as she lay still in her sleeping bag. The soft sounds of the night, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, felt too loud, too close. She forced her eyes shut and tried to block out the strange sense of discomfort. Her mind spun with possibilities, but she couldn't find the right answer. All she wanted was sleep, to forget about the growing unease gnawing at her. Samantha woke with a start in the middle of the night. Something had disturbed her sleep. She lay still, straining her ears, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was again, a faint rustle, like footsteps in the underbrush just beyond her camp. She held her breath, listening closely. The sound came again, this time unmistakably closer. Her first instinct was to convince herself it was just an animal. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. No animal moved like that. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The silence of the forest felt oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. She reached for her flashlight and flicked it on, scanning the darkness outside her tent. But all she saw was the thick blackness of the trees, the shadows cast by the dim light of the fire pit. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. It was nothing. Probably just an animal wandering through. She turned off the flashlight, but the feeling lingered. Her pulse quickened as the rustling grew more pronounced, closer now, as if someone, or something, was moving just outside her camp, circling. Samantha's thoughts raced. What if it was someone else out here? A hiker? A lost camper? The idea seemed unlikely. This was a remote area, far from any trails or campsites. But the possibility gnawed at her. She didn't have a cell signal out here, and her only means of communication was the old radio she'd packed for emergencies. Her instincts told her to confront whatever was out there, but fear held her in place. The rustling stopped. Silence again. It was enough to drive anyone mad, the waiting, the unknown. Was she alone, or was someone lurking in the trees? The following day, the eerie feeling didn't subside. If anything, it grew stronger. The forest around her seemed darker, more suffocating. As she hiked deeper into the woods, the trees closed in on her, their branches reaching like twisted fingers. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head, but the nagging sensation that she was being followed wouldn't leave. Every step she took felt like she was being pulled deeper into the forest's grip. The day was clouded over, the sky a dull gray that mirrored her growing sense of unease. She decided to push on, hoping the long hike would tire her out and bring some peace of mind. But it only made things worse. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Even the birds had stopped chirping. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. By midday, Samantha was back at camp, but the odd feeling didn't fade. The firewood she'd collected was disturbed, the stack slightly rearranged as if someone had moved it. She frowned, wondering if it was just the wind. But then she noticed something else, footprints. Fresh ones, right near the fire pit. They were large, heavy, and unmistakably human. But there was no sign of anyone around. She looked around the campsite, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood just at the edge of her vision. She spun, but saw nothing. That night, as the darkness closed in once more, Samantha sat by the fire, the unsettling feeling eating at her. The forest around her was suffocatingly quiet. Every crackling ember from the fire seemed too loud, too sharp in the stillness. Her flashlight was nearby, her grip tightening on it as she stared into the blackness beyond the camp. Something was out there. Then, she saw it. A shape, just at the edge of the trees. A figure standing motionless, watching her. It was too far for her to make out details, but it was there. The flicker of movement. Her heart raced. She stood slowly, ready to grab the flashlight and make a break for it. The figure didn't move. But as her foot shifted, the figure vanished into the darkness as if it had never been there. Her breath caught in her throat, and her pulse pounded in her ears. It wasn't an animal. It was human. And it was watching her. The following morning, Samantha woke with a heavy, suffocating feeling in her chest. She had barely slept, tossing and turning in her tent, the images of the figure from the night before haunting her thoughts. Had it been real? Or was she just seeing things out of fear? She couldn't decide, but her instinct told her it didn't matter. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, wasn't going to leave her alone. After breakfast, she decided to pack up and move. The peaceful refuge she had hoped for was slipping away, replaced by a gnawing, persistent dread. The footprints near the fire, the shape in the trees, these things couldn't be ignored. Samantha knew that staying in the same spot would be a terrible idea. She wanted to hike out and find her way back to civilization, but the trailhead was miles away, and she couldn't afford to wander aimlessly. She'd have to wait until daylight to find the way back. However, as the sun sank lower in the sky, the fear only deepened. Her camp felt more isolated than ever. She noticed the sounds of the forest had shifted, the usual gentle rustling of leaves and chirping of birds gone. The trees seemed to close in around her as though something in the forest was pushing back against her presence. The feeling of being stalked, the quiet rustling, the odd footprints, kept creeping into her mind. She picked up her gear, moving as quietly as possible, but she was no longer in a rush to make her way back to the trail. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her jump, her nerves on edge. The figure from the previous night had left a trail of unease she couldn't shake, and the eerie silence had only deepened her sense of foreboding. She paused near the creek, hearing something just ahead. It was a soft sound, barely a whisper. She crouched, squinting into the shadows, straining to see. There it was again, the movement. A figure darted from one tree to another, barely visible against the dimming light. She froze. There was no mistaking it. Someone was following her. She had no idea who, but she couldn't ignore the sense that it was the same presence she had felt last night. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and panic began to rise. She needed to get away, fast. But as she turned to run, the figure stepped out into the clearing, blocking her path. Samantha backed away, her breath shallow and rapid, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The figure stood there, tall and ominous, its features obscured by the shadows. Fear gripped her heart, but the voice that came from the figure froze her in place. "Don't be afraid," it said in a raspy, quiet tone. Samantha's mind reeled. The voice didn't sound human. She felt her pulse race and her throat tighten with fear. The figure stepped closer, its movements deliberate and unnervingly slow. As it drew nearer, she finally saw it clearly, a tall, gaunt man with a face that was half covered by a tattered cloth, his eyes dark and hollow. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, as though he had been living in the forest for some time. "What do you want?" Samantha demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped even closer, his gaze intense and unblinking. "I can help you," he murmured. The words sent a chill through her, and she instinctively took a step back, her mind racing. Help? Was this man part of some bizarre survivalist group? Or was he a lunatic? The last few days of isolation had left her on edge, but there was something about this encounter that didn't sit right. "Something wrong. I'm not here to hurt you," the man continued, his voice soft but steady. "You've been followed. You're not alone in these woods." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "Followed?" she whispered, feeling the color drain from her face. She couldn't understand. "Who's following me?" The man's eyes flickered toward the shadows behind her. "The one who watches, always watches," he whispered. "The one who doesn't belong." Samantha's stomach turned. She hadn't seen anyone else, but the man's words struck a nerve. Was there more to this forest than she understood? Was she being hunted by something unseen? The tension in the air grew thick, and she realized, with sudden clarity, that she had been naive to think she was safe. The man's words were like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She could feel the chill of the forest creeping closer, and she instinctively wanted to run, but the man's presence held her in place. He spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper, his breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. "They're close. They're watching," he said. "We need to leave. Now." Fear surged through Samantha as she turned to flee, but the man's hand shot out and grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, like iron, and she tried to yank her arm free, but he held tight. "No, you don't understand," he said urgently. "You can't escape them alone." For a moment, she stood there, unsure of what to do. Everything in her screamed to get away from him, to run, but the growing sense of dread made it impossible to think clearly. She felt trapped. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice strained. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes flickered nervously, and he glanced around. "They are something older than the forest. Something that has been here for centuries. It waits, watches, and it preys on anyone who dares to come too close." A shiver ran down Samantha's spine. She could barely process his words, the weight of them too much to grasp fully. What was he talking about? Was this some sort of twisted game? Was he mentally unstable? She took a deep breath and pulled away from him, her mind racing. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath. "I need to leave now." She turned and began to run, her legs pumping beneath her as she sprinted through the trees. The sound of her heartbeat thudded in her ears, louder than the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But as she ran, a distant sound reached her, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper of movement in the underbrush. Then, the unmistakable feeling that she was being pursued. She looked over her shoulder, but saw nothing. Just darkness. But the sound was there again, growing closer. The brush behind her stirred with deliberate, slow steps. She wasn't alone. Someone, something, was following her, and it wasn't human. Her heart raced, and panic surged through her body. She couldn't keep running forever. She needed to fight back. Her gaze swept the area frantically, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the ground, but she didn't care. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to let whatever was stalking her catch up. She pushed forward, faster now, weaving between trees, desperate to get away. The whispering grew louder, and then, suddenly, the figure emerged from the trees ahead of her. The man with the cloth-covered face stepped into her path, his outstretched arms blocking her way. Samantha froze, her chest heaving as she stared at him. "Move," she shouted, her voice trembling. The man's expression remained calm, his eyes narrowed. "You can't outrun them," he said. "You can't escape." Samantha's mind was racing as she looked around for any way to break free. The terror in her chest overwhelmed her senses, but one thought kept repeating: she needed to survive. Samantha's pulse pounded in her ears as the man's words echoed in her mind. "You can't outrun them." She didn't know who or what they were, but right now, he was in her way. The fear surged, pushing her forward with a surge of adrenaline. "Get out of my way," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. She darted left, trying to move around the man blocking her path, but he sidestepped effortlessly, anticipating her every move. His grip shot out, and she barely dodged it, slipping and falling to the ground, but she quickly scrambled to her feet, her breathing shallow, her body trembling. She couldn't keep running. The terror creeping behind her was closing in faster than she could run. She knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a person following her. It was something more. The whispers of movement, the strange figure in the shadows, the feeling of being hunted, it all pointed to something dark, something ancient. Samantha gritted her teeth, trying to clear her panicked thoughts. The man with the tattered cloth wasn't just a bystander, he was part of this nightmare. He knew what was out there. "You know what's following me, don't you?" Samantha's voice cracked, but her eyes locked onto the man's. "Tell me what it is." The man said nothing, his face hard as stone. He only stepped back, the shadows behind him shifting in a way that sent chills running down her spine. And then she heard it. A low growl, deep and rumbling, like an animal, but bigger, darker, a sound that didn't belong to any creature she had ever encountered. It came from the trees behind them, closer than she had ever heard. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble as something massive shifted in the underbrush. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes dark with something between fear and resignation. "It's here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It's coming." Samantha didn't have time to process the words. The growl grew louder, closer. Her heart skipped as she felt the air grow colder, the weight of something unseen bearing down on her. She turned to run, but the man's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a force she couldn't break free from. "You can't escape," he said in a tone that was chillingly calm. "It's already here." Without thinking, Samantha kicked the man in the shin as hard as she could, using every ounce of strength in her body. He staggered back, releasing his grip, and for the first time since their encounter began, she had a chance to escape. But only for a moment. As she bolted through the trees, the growl sounded closer, and the ground began to quake beneath her feet. Samantha's mind raced. She was terrified, but her instinct was clear: she had to survive. She had to outsmart whatever was chasing her. She reached the creek, the water tumbling over the rocks in a rush. In the panic, she misjudged her step and slipped, falling into the freezing stream. The cold water bit at her skin, numbing her instantly, but she didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and continued moving, her body shaking from the chill and the fear. Behind her, the growl grew louder, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rattle the very trees. She reached the edge of a steep cliff and skidded to a halt. Her breath caught as she realized she was trapped. There was no way forward, no way back. She was cornered. The thing that was chasing her was coming closer. Samantha turned around, preparing to face the terror head-on, her heart racing. Through the trees, the figure she had seen earlier emerged, its shape unmistakable in the dim light. But it wasn't alone. Out from the shadows came another, and another, and another. She counted 3 figures, each one towering, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were the ones watching her. In that moment, the man's words came back to her: "It's here." Samantha's heart skipped a beat as the figures drew closer. She had no choice. She could either face whatever this thing was or die trying to escape. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached into her pack, desperate for anything that might help. Her hands closed around a flare gun, one of the few things she had packed for emergencies. Without thinking, she aimed it toward the sky and pulled the trigger. The bright flare burst into the dark, slicing through the night like a comet. The figures recoiled, their movements jerky and unnatural as the light seared their eyes. For a brief moment, everything went still. Samantha's heart hammered in her chest as she realized it had worked. The figures hesitated, their shadowy forms flickering in and out of sight, as though the light had somehow banished them. But she didn't wait to find out if the effect was permanent. She turned, scrambling down the rocky slope, not daring to look back. With every ounce of strength, she fought against the darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. Samantha didn't stop running until she saw the glimmer of the trailhead in the distance. Her legs were like jelly, her breath ragged, and her mind was fogged with exhaustion. But when she finally emerged from the trees, it was with a feeling of overwhelming relief. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, the flare still burning brightly in her hand, though it was now a faint, flickering ember. She had made it. The terror that had stalked her through the forest, the shadows that had hunted her every step, it was over. Or at least, she hoped it was. The figures were gone, their presence dissipated with the flare. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and with shaking hands, she pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She had a signal. Tears welled in her eyes as she dialed for help. She didn't care if they didn't believe her. She just needed to hear a voice, to know she wasn't alone anymore. As she waited for the call to connect, Samantha looked back toward the trees, her heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever dark force had stalked her in the pines would never truly leave her. But for now, she had survived. And that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this thrilling story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Check out the videos on the screen for more suspenseful adventures.